Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm Patrick Tucker. I'm technology editor for Defense One. This is my first notice. I'm quite enjoying the humidity here in Tampa in August. If you're a connoisseur of humidity, this is some of, it's like a flourless chocolate cake. It's just dense and pure. Oh, it's great. And thank you so much, Terry, for joining me on stage. So who here today was present during Lieutenant General Ashley's opening remarks? If you saw those, raise your hand. Got a few folks. More people are like, they should have been. Okay, no, they were excellent. He's actually a great speaker. We're going to touch on some of those topics today. And who here, additionally, is an analyst or works in an analyst capacity at DIA? If you are, okay, we've got a couple. That's great. Now I'm going to put some pressure on you because I want you to start thinking of some questions or even sharing observations about how things could work a little bit better in terms of new technology that might help you do your job. So I'm going to put some pressure on you to fill the void that is left over when my intellect departs, and also help us understand, Terry in particular, like what emerging technology can do specifically for you. I should probably put the mic closer to my face. So with that, Terry, give us a sense very quickly. I'm sure many people here are familiar with the Mars program that you lead, but maybe many aren't. And you gave an update today, and maybe some people missed it. But a quick update on what is Mars and what you're doing there.
Sure. So Mars is the machine-assisted analytic rapid repository system. We need a big, long title when you have a big program. What it is doing, it's replacing an old system called the Modern Integrated Database. Those words are pretty much meaningless. At the core of this, DI has this very important mission, and that mission is to support the warfighter. The way we support the warfighter is through something called foundational intelligence. Foundational intelligence is everything we want to know about our adversaries, right? How they operate, what they use, how they fight, where they go, right? And for decades now, we've used a system called MIDB to support that foundational intelligence mission. We literally speak to the warfighter with data. We may speak to the Pentagon or to Washington, D.C. with a paper, right, with a product that's an assessment. But to the warfighter, this is a data story. It's always been a data story. Mars recognizes that that system has gotten long in the tooth. It's been around for decades. It needs a technology refactoring to begin with. And secondly, we also recognize that the mission of DoD is changing. Just as we're moving to autonomous cars, we're moving to autonomous military. That requires data. At the foundation of all this, right, is this data story. So we have to move to a much larger, broader, in-depth, and advanced data understanding. That's the cornerstone of Mars that will propel all of these other DIA missions and all these other warfighter missions that we support.
Okay, excellent. So you just brought up what used to be to me an obscure topic, but I've been doing some reporting recently on the big Jedi Cloud contract that the Pentagon is trying to push through, where they're moving toward an enterprise-level cloud. And that is when I first became really familiar with the MIDB and how bad a job it's doing for a lot of folks that are doing very important work on the front lines. Like there's a real need to fill a data delivery void where you've got folks that are perhaps in forward operating bases that aren't getting data from another forward operating base that's like just a few clicks away because that has to go through this long and like ridiculous process. So I wonder if you can give us a sense, because Lieutenant General Ashley brought this up a little bit this morning, how the current state of both data IT and just general defense IT matches up with where you want to go.
Sure. First is, the interoperability with data coming from systems that are data around AO level technology. Interoperability was a hard thing to achieve. In 20-some years since then, interoperability has gotten a lot better, right? So the concept of moving data around, and we all do this as consumers on our phones, is pretty simple. You can put a Netflix movie on almost any device. In fact, I think Netflix supports 3,000 devices, and it's putting gigabytes of data through a wireless network on your phone, right? So some of this concept is taking advantage of all that disruption that has taken place. The second part of that is making sure that you're continuously improving, that you're agile in technology development with things like Mars, so that the next disruption, you're not in this reflexive state where you're you're always playing catch up, right? You're bulletproofing against the future. Now, the difficulty here is that interoperability question, right? Because this is a global network with seriously impinged folks who have little to no bandwidth. There is no 4G at that forward operating base, right? So you have a technology infrastructure concern that you have to get around, and there's good ways, and we address that with Mars. Then you have some really good things on the back end, starting with cloud computing. Cloud computing solves what MIDB couldn't solve 25 years ago, scaleless compute. We made decisions 25 years ago that we couldn't include all of the data, that we had to limit the amount of data because the systems couldn't support it. So we made decisions today we would never make. Today, we store all the data, all of its provenance, right? That's not a problem. We don't run out of disk, and disk is really cheap in a cloud. So that's really important for us to understand is first and foremost, we have this scaleless and very advanced compute state today, and you have much greater ability to be interoperable with data. It's almost, in many of our modern settings, it's almost not even a concern anymore. However, out in the field, it's still a concern. And some of our older legacy technologies that are out there are still a very, very big concern, right? So you have legacy technology, limited bandwidth, that we have to overcome. Some of that legacy technology does not evaporate overnight with Mars. We still have to speak back, in a sense, in time to those systems. So that's a lot what's going on. With advanced technologies, we loosely use the term of art AI, we also have the ability to do compute at the edge, right? That's the other part of this. It's not just getting the data to the edge, but there's going to have to be compute at the edge so you can do those predictive things that we're doing back in DC all the way out at that fob.
Yeah. So on this is another thing that Lieutenant General Ashley brought up today that I thought was fascinating. He talked about building a virtual model of the adversary and the adversary's activities. And I was like, on the one hand, that sounds like something that Herman Kahn or some of the futurists in the 1950s and the 1960s were thinking up, that's what they wanted to make, was like a constantly up-to-date and updating model of what the adversary was doing. And if you've ever seen War Games, like the movie, that's kind of what the Whopper is supposed to be, right? It's like this huge, constantly updating digital red team. So on the one hand, it's like a classic idea, but on the other hand, it's not something that I've ever actually seen in real life. So give me a sense of like how you create and what it looks like, a real like live simulation of an adversarial force.
Sure, absolutely. So in our world, we have a slight understanding of that. Those who have supported the military, they know what a doctrinal template looks like, right? Where we will lay out a military and its adversary's capability is a series of really wacky symbology called 2525B, all right? And we'll lay this out and we'll say doctrinally, this is how these guys fight. Then we have the situational side. This is what we know, where they are and how they go. Right. And this is a constant iteration of any military intelligence unit. They're always doing this at all periods of time, is keeping that understanding of the doctrine and the situation. In Mars, this changes. One, let's start with the doctrinal. That changes over time, right? So it has to also be something that's adaptive and something that we can insert into, right? We can't, the doctrines change, units change, and militaries move a lot, right? We have adversaries who are expeditionary now. They can travel the world, right? They subordinate units and they change. On the situational side, I think this is where Mars really comes into effect. Our way of seeing and knowing that battle space has been really augmented and really is improved by the onset of the Internet of Things, right? Our ability to look to any place in the world, just as you as a consumer could look up this address in Google Maps and get yourself here. You could also look at all the attributions and the situational awareness of what's going around here. We can do the same thing in Mars, right? We can bring that correlated information to that situational understanding in vast new ways that we could never do 5 or even 10 years ago. So in addition to cloud, you introduce Internet of Things or whatever you want to call the big data revolution as a way to augment that understanding. Now, fusing that, binding that, making that a consumer level product that a user in that fob can easily accept and take advantage of, that's a real challenge, right? You have to contextualize that, and that's part of what we're building with industry in Mars.
Yeah, the Internet of Things it's such this like weird buzzword, and so few people have like a sense of like how it connects to what they actually do, and it's like national security importance. And I must confess that I was sort of in that camp until a little while ago during the Trump-Putin meeting in Helsinki, there was this massive attack on a lot of the open Internet of Things ports that were in Helsinki, including CCTV cameras, and it was coming from China. So like that gets you a sense of like what the Internet of Things actually means in the future of open source intelligence. And just today, actually, I heard he works for you. His name is, I think his name is Brian Drake, and he runs this program called Sabre.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep, absolutely.
And this was is there anyone here from the media? This is mine. I don't even get to have this. All right, so Brian Drake runs this program called Sabre, and they're using just tons of open source intelligence to figure out the pedigree chain of different pieces of fentanyl production.
Yes, it's
So that's
fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. So tell us a little bit about this. This is a fascinating thing that I hadn't heard about before.
So yeah, it's fascinating, and it really touches on AI application for an analytical process, and Sabre is a fantastic, great example of that, right? So what it does is it builds those semantic connections or graph-based connections, depending on how you're looking at this, right? So it is doing the neural network work for you, and then it has the analytics to say, hey, these relationships matter, right? That allows us, think what our time-honored profession is, right? An analyst 30 or 40 years ago was a really avid reader. To guess what? The same problem, this big data deluge that we live in, nearly unimaginable amounts of data, allows us to begin to overcome that. This is why we call it machine-assisted, right? Mars isn't about replacing the analyst, it's improving the analyst understanding of their trade, of what they do by this practice. And Sabre is this fantastic example of how we can get that information flow going, understand supply chains, understand loose, weak signal connections that are all out there, and automated enough that an analyst can take it and use it, right? And it's discoverable enough that we also can understand the methodologies that got us there. Also very, very important to what we do.
Yeah, the methodology thing is huge. This was crazy. So basically, like you can go through a bunch of open source data. You can look through 43 different million different websites, and if you find a supplier address that points to a vacant field, and you have to bring in a lot of different databases to figure out that supplier address points to a vacant field, it's probably because the person that put that supplier address on that sheet was lying about where their operations were based, right? And that gives you a clue. And then you collate that with a bunch of other data. And you can do that in a way that's now helping like law enforcement all around the world. So I wonder if you can give us a couple of other, if you can, and I know many of the good ones you cannot, but if you can, a couple of other examples of where you're using AI and ML in like an operational way, like right now.
Yeah, so a couple areas we could talk about openly here. Really, humanitarian assistance. About 10 years ago, there was a big earthquake in Haiti, and there was this big crowdsource effect, one of the first ones ever. Basically, the satellite imagery company said, here's our data, and the NGOs got together and put YouTube videos up and said, here's how to make roads and draw roads in satellite imagery. And State Department, I can now say this, called us and said, Terry, we don't have the ability to act fast enough here, but you do. Can you put a person in a server in Miami to coordinate and bind all this data? And we did. And in 3 days, we mapped every road, every street, everything you can think of to start to include blue tarps and down buildings. And then we were able to take that data and push it to 26MU, Staff Sergeant Travis Halleck, he works at DIA now, just the day before they went ashore. So they went from little knowledge and understanding of that infrastructure, right? So that was a good data story, right? So the second where that begins to advance is years later, we had a similar problem. We saw a major Ebola outbreak happening, and we began to see this really cross-border spread, and it became a concern. And the concept was, if you're going to insert humanitarian assistance in this literally this contagious environment that's coming across, where do you insert? So we went and we looked at our data, and we had 2 border crossings between the 2 countries of interest, so that we don't castigate them, I won't name them. We did another crowdsource effect in 3 days, cost DIA $3,000. We identified 550 other border crossings that were in use. Wow. Then we began to use some early versions of iterative, what you today would think of machine learning, to go, okay, what's our high frequency places? Mm-hmm. If we know where they're traveling, we know where this transit is occurring, but you have 550 options, what's the highest frequency, highest probability of transit, right? And so we did some great analysis to get that to say, okay, insert here. Mm-hmm. Third one, it's still a couple years old. There was a huge earthquake in Nepal, lots of earthquakes in this.
Yeah.
And what we noticed early on was a lot of the humanitarian focus and a lot of the coverage, and this happens, there's a media bias in relief as well, was all focused on Kathmandu. And we began to say, hey, wait a second, let's look at the big data signal coming from outside of Kathmandu, because there's a core periphery problem that we always face here. And we were able to do very, very quickly was train, gather, collect, and assess. There was far greater infrastructure damage at the outlying cities than in Kathmandu. Kathmandu was devastated, but it got even worse out there. And those are the remote areas in a humanitarian disaster recovery situation that you worry about the most, because this is where you can have, if you can get to the main city, great. You can probably head off catastrophic loss of life. And the periphery, if you don't know what's happening, things can go south in a hurry. So it was a place where we were able to auto-generate the data and get to the assessment very, very quickly. Those are three really good use cases that sort of bring us a generation. We learned how to create the data, we learned how to do something with the data, and then we allowed that automation and let the data collection happen and let the analysis happen in as automated a way as we can think of.
Okay. As we keep talking, if you guys have questions, we really want you to participate. So feel free to start raising your hands now or early, especially if you have one. Sometimes folks get a little shy at first, but as you begin to think about questions, don't be shy about raising your hand. I'm going to see you, and we'll keep talking, and then we'll get your question, your comment in, so that we can include it, and so we have like a dynamic conversation, which is a thing that I like to have. So one of the things that you just mentioned was all of these different uses of artificial intelligence. And the Pentagon right now has another corollary effort in artificial intelligence through the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. It's headed up by Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan. He's a very nice guy. Recommend him to all of you if you've never met him before. And give me a sense of how your activity and that activity are separate and complement one another.
Sure, absolutely. Mars and Jake and a few other lesser-known AI initiatives all have the same genesis in time, going back 2 to 3 years ago. Mars, and we deliberately took the ground of our problem was the foundational intelligence. That's our doctrinal mission at DIA to support the warfighter. And to do autonomous work, the data has to be right.
Well, but first, define foundational intelligence for
folks. So foundational intelligence is everything we know, we need to know about our adversaries so that we can conduct all of our military planning, strategy, and operations, right? It is literally the database about the other. So it's something that DI has managed and run for decades and decades. Most of you would know that through MIDB, right? It is a core mission area of DIA, and it is how we speak to the warfighter.
Okay, that is how.
So we took the approach of there is going to be algorithmic development out in the world, and there are going to be big programs doing it across large mission sets and doing the applied use of AI, and that's fantastic. Mm-hmm. If I were to reduce this to a single concept, to think of that as that AI algorithmic library. It's more complicated than that, but we can reduce and say, hey, if Jake is going to build a library of AI, we are going to be the enabling element. We're going to feed it its data that it needs to run.
Okay.
Now that Mars has to be at the edge, and Mars has to do AI things, and Mars also has to scale to support that, right? It does also lend itself to, and those of you who've played in this world understand that the processing, the compute, and the data need to be right next to one another. So we have a very close working relationship with Jake, with AIM over at ODNI, and the other AI initiatives that are out there.
Okay. So one of the things that I've heard in terms of discussions about where Jake needs to go, and one of the things that you talked about is all of this Defense Department data. And on the one hand, we're told all the time that the Defense Department is sitting on data. It's just way too much data. There's way too much video footage data for them to process humanly. There's way too much data in this place, but we also hear about how there's not enough data because it's all siloed, right? You've got all of this logistics and diagnostics data that's coming off the F-35, and it's all sitting in one place. And so give me a sense of what data you need to be released in order to make the Mars dream more of a reality.
Sure, there's multiple parts of that story. And first is a lot of our understanding of the world is driven by that Internet of Things concept, right? That publicly available information is clearly the first thing to understand. There is then what the General Ashley calls the pristine data, right? and that is the traditional intelligence feeds and data that we are used to working in. All of those agencies have, I won't say their version of Mars, but they have their technology improvement efforts, right? So instead of moving from, traditional kind of old school thinking of feeds of information, we're looking at redimensioning how we're going to become interoperable with that data. That data is not locked, it is not data we have to unlock. It's data we have worked with, we're just changing the scale that we work with it and our ability to interact with it, right? That's that big interoperability. Down in DoD, it's a different story because DoD is very large and very complicated. Mars, and I think General Shanahan has once said there's 1,300 data standards in DoD. To give you an idea of how complex the problem is.
Yeah.
So we take a different approach to Mars. First, we talk about light interoperability. And you'll hear us use the term a thin data model. It turns out, for us to exchange data, there's only a few things we need to know. And this is a very common consumer model. Amazon used this to get all booksellers online. They only tag 10 things on a book to get Amazon up and running. Right. Now, look where they are today. We're using a similar consumer model in the future to do this, right? There's a sensor over there. I need a relationship with the data on the sensor. If I know the basic facts of time, location, security, lightweight attribution about that, and some uniqueness in the data, then I can establish a relationship. And then this is where I think it changes a little bit in the advantage of AI technology, where we can focus on what Mars can do. Once I have data going back and forth, they're getting the foundational intelligence they need, and they need to know where in the world it is and when in the world it is, first and foremost, and a very simple description of what it is, and they are in business. When it comes back to me, it's the burden of Mars then to be, okay, I'm going to normalize that data. Mars has to do the data conditioning to say, it meets my standardization rules, right? To put that burden on all those systems, the F-35 and all those warfighter acquisition systems, is a heavy burden. We don't want to do that.
Oh yeah, Lockheed's going to be mad.
Yeah, I know. We need a thin relationship there. We need a thin relationship with our partners when we exchange data with them. So we look at this. It does not mean that we're eschewing those 1,300 standards. We value them, and there's some terrific ones out there. It means that we're going to put that burden on us so that we can get that interoperability established and up and running. Very, very important concept for those disparate data sources that are out there.
Okay, so we've got, like we said, we've got a couple DIA analysts here. I wonder if either of you have a thought about what you're hearing in terms of how that could make your life better, in terms of, how it could make your life somehow different. If it sounds like there's a new role for you, or if there's some new chores that you have to do, would love to hear your thoughts or questions from analysts. Shy? No. Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
So, Jeff Davis, as an all-source analyst, I think the biggest thing that for us is the trust of the information. So as I put the information into an object and I leave it for a week and I come back, who has had access to that object? Who's made changes to it to make sure that, this is unclassed, so Qasem Soleimani is the Quds Force commander today when I left it, but tomorrow I come back or next week I come back and he's an ice cream salesman from, Fiji or something like that, right? What mechanism do you see put in place that we can ensure that we can trust that when we go back, it's got the integrity, it's updated by authorized people or systems, and deconflicts from the other object libraries that are out there?
So we've been playing, to get there, a couple things. We've been playing with the concept of confidence in data for a number of years. We knew when we moved into the big data business with programs such as GOSSIP or Foundational Intelligence Modernization, Foundry, Fishnet, that we were moving to data that there weren't enough human beings to assess it all. So we needed to automate our understanding of confidence, and we've been working on that for about 5 years. And I will confess to you, probably the most arguments I have had in the last 5 years were about that, because we're conflating data, we're correlating information, and we're bringing in data from the outside, right? So we've learned a lot about how to get to confidence and concepts like multiplicity and things like that allow us to say, hey, without a human being, how can we get there? The other thing is a cultural problem. We know statistically that the big data that we're getting in from multiple points, right? If 3 large Fortune 10 companies in the world say this is a bank, it's probably a bank, right? Those are 3 independent sources, and we have our own sources to bring to it. So we learned that a lot of the crowd and the big data that we're getting in was at very high precision and recall rate. But we had a problem because analysts didn't see it and they're used to visual inspection of the data. We had this cultural problem of overcoming that gap, which is why we kind of have moved stepwise through different things that we're doing. And there's places where that kind of big data lends itself well. Infrastructure data, right? You all can imagine if I have 1,000 pictures of a bridge that I collected in social media or something like that, it's a bridge. It was a bridge this morning when that picture was taken, right? That's not a hard concept. That's an easy concept. But if I say it's something that we have very little information on and it's indoors, it's harder to get to that confidence. So we're working with those confidence, and it's always the concept of trust and veracity of the data is always analyst influence, and the governance that we're setting up for Mars is such that if we see and we lose our trust in a data source, very important, that we can move out. Second thing is provenance. Because we have cloud computing, if you go into our newer data holdings today, every bit of everything we've ever done and every way that we've conditioned the data is retained. On average, if we collect something out in the wild, in the open source, and we bring it to MIDB, it goes through on average about 27 different iterations in that data journey. That's how much data conditioning is going on. At any point in time, you, the user, have the ability to discover through all of that data if you want to. We also reserve some of that interim state for future use. So when you start doing heavier AI-related activities, you may want to go back to that data in a rawer state than we're presenting it, so that you have the ability to source and trust that data, and sourcing's such a big part of it. Next, yes, exposing the logs, because we're moving from a single editor environment, right, to multiple editor environment, exposing and understanding and capturing the decision making. I'm going to assess that tank as a tank, but I discussed it with the combatant command before we made that assessment, right? We want to capture that as part of that record, not just the label or the tagging of that data, but what was the decision-making process that happened. All those are components of the data management system, and data management is about 80% of the Mars concept, right? So we can capture all of that, because all of those future missions and all those fun, exciting things we're going to need to do rely on that, and we also need that critical understanding of why that decision was made, which we couldn't capture before.
So, journalist question, how long does it take for a source to go from credible to not credible today, and how can it go faster, and when will it go faster?
Once it's established, about 6 minutes today. So it goes pretty good. However, gaining that cultural trust, right, of the analytic community that we're supporting may take months, right? And that's a good, necessary process, because what we're putting out isn't data. And if Neil Wiley were here, our functional manager, and as analyst, our boss, he would say, what we're putting out is assessed intelligence. It is something that we must defend and stand by. It's not data. So therefore, it is subject to everything we do in our tradecraft standards and our methodological standards, and it must be approved as such. So when I talk about confidence intervals in our data, that's a tradecraft issue for us, right? That's how we see this, right? We see that the end of the outjust part of Mars is tradecraft, and because it's going to our most critical missions out in the world. So that's a little different than just saying, okay, I have an object and I'm going to do a bunch of entity extraction and glom onto an object. That's not what we're doing in Mars. That's a technical part of what we're doing, but then we have to assess that in an automated way and put it forward. Sometimes that process can take months. It really is situationally dependent, right? If there's good knowledge out in the world about something, if we can get to very rapid data modeling of that automation, we can do that in weeks, right? We have not done this for all MIDB objects yet, right? We're focused on those things that we can automate today, but we work hand in glove with the analytic community supporting that to make sure that that tradecraft is solid and bulletproof when we go forward.
Is there a place in the world where those data sources go from credible to uncredible faster than others because of the amount of noise in the environment or adversarial activity sort of thing?
Yeah, all of our big data sources are somewhat perishable. We accept that. They come, they go. User preference changes in the world. And in the United States, we tend to be a little bit slower than the rest of the world in user preference. What you'll see in Europe and Asia is they'll move through different platforms much more quickly than we have. and especially in countries, and this is kind of a unique thing that we've noticed, in countries where they came late to the technology, I mean, they started with a smartphone. They didn't have a flip phone, they didn't have a cell phone before that. They tend to be the ones that go through technology adaptation faster than other countries. I can't explain it other than they seem to not be stuck on their branding like we are here, especially middle-aged people.
I think I'm now middle-aged. Yeah, but okay. Go ahead.
So we see that happening in the world, right? There's preference changes that happen in the world, and then so we're adaptive to that, and that's something that you're always in, and you heard the director today talking about starting an open source center, right? Is always adapting to that changing nature. The other thing is, there are some data out there that people would not want us to have, and we respect that in every way, shape, and form. If a U.S. company decides they don't want to share that data, then okay, we abide by those rules. So we have learned to live with this shifting landscape. What we do benefit from, though, is I have many, many sources agreeing out in the world that that's a bank, right? That that's a hospital, that that's a mosque and a school. And that is really beneficial, right? It's the multitudes of sources, right? Not just the volume of data that really give us the high confidence and that lack of perishable, here today, gone tomorrow effect in some of the big data.
So get your questions ready, because we don't have too much time left. I want to turn now to our other analysts to ask one and make a note if he can. And the rest of you, if you got a question, raise your hand so I can make sure that I get you before we bow out. Okay, he's right there, that guy.
Thank you. Brian Mushrush, based out of here at CENTCOM.
Okay.
Foundational intelligence is kind of like the encyclopedic break glass in support of an operation. Better to have it newer than others. But when you're doing current intel, more anticipatory analysis, how do you see AI transforming that or moving into that realm, which is I see that being a little bit more difficult?
Yeah. So there's the speed with the veracity, right? And a lot of those. So and then getting that out to you and to the other edge states. So I think if you look at some of the prediction AI that we're doing today, you're beginning to see the ability for the machine to monitor at scale what we can't monitor ourselves. And I think that's the first thing you look at, right? We can train the machine, and I just refer to this very loosely, as if I have all these objects in the world, the machine can monitor them. From a data standpoint, there's an energy being emitted on that hospital every single day, right? If that energy stops or triples, send a note. Send that analyst. You may want to look here. Something's going on, right? I can Z-score that, right? It's more complicated than that. If I begin to add our other sources of information, so the first effect you get in Mars is kind of that global monitoring effect, right? I am going to get strong signal indicators coming out from the world of change. And that's really important. What I want to get to in your world is the weak signal, right? Like with the Sabre-related technologies, where we're looking for patterns, anomalies, and enigmas in that same current environment that are the early tipping point of Arab Spring, right? And that is the future space. And I'm going to confess to you, I have been looking for weak signals in our data for years now, because I think, it's there, right? And I go back and I replay some of the significant events that we've done that were big, large lifts for us there. And what I've learned is the weak signals were right in front of our face and we missed them. And so I think it's possible to help you in that regard, but that is something we need to spend a lot more time. And this is, I sound like a broken record. This is also where we're trying to open Mars up in a very transparent way to industry to help us with those kinds of problems.
Also, if you are interested in the future of big data as it applies to predictive analytics and anticipatory intelligence, there's a very good book called The Naked Future by Patrick Tucker. I highly recommend it. Okay, right here in the pink shirt. Yes.
Hi, I was wondering what advice or recommendations would you give to a smaller technology? Sorry about that. What advice or recommendations would you give to a smaller technology company or startup that has expertise in some of the areas that you've called out tonight, such as AI and machine learning, predictive intelligence, and really wants to support the Mars effort, but doesn't have an existing working relationship with DIA?
So a couple things. First, we have an industry day on September 10th. So get ye there. We brought a broad agency announcement out last year on 4 broad topic areas of Mars. This is where we said, industry, help us with these big problem sets. The information integration, the data side of this, some of the order of battle concepts, some of the data security and management, and then some of that ingest, big ingest kind of concepts. So watch that space, because this is how we'll go out. Now, I want to go further than that. We recognize for non-DoD contractors, it's a high barrier entry, and we're trying to push that down. So first thing is, we are not going to use traditional vehicles to reach out and access you, right? There are small business vehicles, there are other transactional authorities that we intend to use so that we could get to you, because we want to. When we put we're very happy with the response we got from the broad agency announcement last year, because we got small and big, traditional to innovative, right? It wasn't the, and it wasn't the usual suspects, which is good, but it was the usual suspects and others. And so we felt like we got a lot of diversity in what we were saying. I am going to confess something that's really hard. Some of the concepts we were trying to convey are very hard for us to do to people not familiar with foundational intelligence, right? So we actually hired some industry consultants who work inside the program. We actually hired a consulting company to help us better communicate with you, because we recognize we're using a vernacular that you're not using, right? So we're trying to bridge that language difference that we have. So we really take this seriously in Mars, and please respond to those announcements. We really do want to hear from you.
Isn't Nedapedia, doesn't that sort of open things up to like small, who here is familiar with Nedapedia? Not, okay, many of you, but not everybody. This is basically the, like the Fed BizOps, but just for DIA, and it moves faster than Fed BizOps. This is something that Lieutenant General Stewart, the former head of DIA, sort of stood up, a way for smaller non-traditional players to come in and pitch stuff to DIA with like analysts in the room, and like the pitching worked much faster. It's very much sort of like how the Defense Department wants all of its pitching to be now, but at DIA it was actually working because they're all dealing with data and like software stuff. So they were actually sort of like keeping up. So who here, another question. Somebody, no? Okay, we do, thank you, yeah.
Yes, hello, sir. I have a question about the Mars program. Does any of the information that it accumulates go directly to the warfighter, or does it all go to an analyst?
So, no, it does. So we, and I mentioned.
No, it does.
Yeah. So we, I have this really old house. It's 100 and some years old. So if you were to try to trace the wiring in the house, it's impossible. There's no way. You would have to pull it out and start over. Same thing with MIDB and Mars. We speak through the big national systems, and we understand that relationship well. We also understand there are hundreds of pathways getting data out to the warfighter that aren't not well understood. And when the data goes from us to a national system like a DSIGs or a GEEKS, and then down to subordinate systems from there, we lose an understanding of where our data goes. There are other systems out there, and by the way, on JWICS alone, MIDB today supports 231 different applications. That's one of our many, many networks that we support. So I want to talk about the diversity of what's going on here. So what's happened over time is there's these relationships that have built, these kind of, that go out there. So that thin data model I talk about is a way to say, hey, I can speak to those big national DSIGs, GEEKS kind of systems. We speak the language of API ICD. That's not a problem for me. We're going to have to speak a different language to support AI, by the way. APIs are not going to hold up to that level of I/O. But down at those thinner environments, yeah, there are a number of those endpoints that exist. The Air Force is trying to map all of those relationships. And I mentioned today, they think they'll get about 75% of that mapped. That's how complicated these relationships are. So it's hard, because if you say define an MIDB or a Mars user, and by the way, once you get to that display at the very end, right, where they've loaded data into a thumb drive into that cockpit, which we watched happen, The person, the operator there, does not know what MIDB is. That's just target data in that display. So there's also a knowledge loss. They don't know DI is part of the story. That's just their view of the battle space. So that's why it's very, very complicated. But yes, there are multiple different varying relationships for a lot of different reasons. With Mars, they will have the ability to directly interact. And one of the things I want to talk about in that is this concept of the national systems, when we talk about data complexity, have not done a good job because they couldn't. There was no capacity for this to take field data, let's just call it that, right? Field data, and bring it all the way back to the national systems. There was no ability to do that, right? Just we couldn't handle that I/O, we couldn't handle how to provision or work with that. Mars changes that understanding because as we build smart sensors that correlate to the target that I have, I need to know that relationship exists. That does not mean that we're building the God machine of data in Mars. I may have a thin relationship there. I may have an index that says a collection was made or something was collected over there, follow this link to get to it. But we want that relationship to exist. So that's why we talk about warfighter systems. It isn't going to be we're just speaking to DSIGs and geeks.
I think we got time for one more. If we got a brave soul. If not, I've got one. Because one of the things that Ashley also brought up today is this big issue, and sort of exactly what you talked about with classification. You've got a whole bunch of stuff coming in. Increasingly, you're going to have to share that with more partners, with multinational coalitions, perhaps with police departments in countries where operators are now find themselves and they have to make a whole bunch of partners really fast. You've got all of this new data sharing that you have to do with all these different people. You've got all this information coming in, and the way classification works now is like kooky and nuts, and it just doesn't work because there's a big bunch of debate that has to happen in bureaucracy around whether or not this piece of information can be seen by X, Y, and Z. So can you give us a sense of what the classification process looks like in the future under Mars and with the help of machine intelligence?
Yeah, one of our core essential beliefs in Mars is a sharing environment, right? So sharing the data as broadly as possible is what we wake up every morning thinking about. Yes, data classification systems are built under more or less what we would consider a tagging concept today, and it's something that we've brought forward through time. So first thing is getting the data more shareable. The insertion of PAI makes the data more shareable, right? Because I can now say I didn't have to use a sensitive source.
What is PAI?
Publicly available information.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse
Not
me.
every,
Sorry.
yeah, okay.
Sorry. So publicly available information means, okay, maybe for your use case to make this data shareable, I can use those data elements, right? That helps a lot. That really helps in the physical world, right? That really helps us because I don't need to say that the bridge, right, is classified, right? 30 years ago or 40 years ago, we had no way to understand that it was there except through classified mechanisms. That has changed. So we have to do this huge data transformation. And I will tell you, it's a huge part of Mars. It's not very exciting. It's transforming the old data to the new where we can resolve a lot of those issues. Secondly, classification systems. What we're trying to do, both on the production and the consumer side, is look at better ways to say that community of interest can receive all of this information. And therefore, I don't have to worry, and it's complicated in this setting, therefore, I'm less concerned about every little nitnoid of what I'm sharing and getting over there. Where we do have to share, we do have the advent of where we do have to be secure, we have the advent of cell level security, right? That's present technology. Before, we had to classify the whole record. So if 98% of it was publicly available information and 2% was classified, guess what? We all know, right? It's classified. Now I can break that apart, right? So cell-based security is a real opportunity to increase sharing and change our construct and get the security that's necessary on just those elements that need to be secured. Very, very important concept. I will caution you about that level of detailed operations in data with this much data. Every time you're doing that security check on each data element, that's an I/O loop. So if you're talking about a lot of data, this is a hard concept because that's a lot of I/O you're chewing up, validating each attribute, each element of your data record, okay? We're not sure what the answer is that yet, but think about that. That is slowing them, that slows you down in that process if you choose to go to cell level security. best thing about this, and this is not Mars, so Odie and I and DoD are taking these concepts of what I would call the automation of security very, very seriously. To move us from a concept that is a tag, which is what it is today, that blanket covers all of your information, to move us to systems that are doing those assessments at the speed of mission and can do automation of assessing security on documents and things like that. That is not my domain, so I don't want to speak too much about it, but we watch that work very, very closely. And it really it really benefits from improvements in, quite simply, identity management, right? Mm-hmm. So much of this used to be, I had to make sure you were you before first I have to make sure I know you and I trust you, and then I can give you some data and you can give me some data. Mm-hmm. Moving beyond that into machine-to-machine concepts is complicated. It's very complicated when you start adding the numbers and the types of data we're fusing in Mars together. Mm-hmm. It's going to make us rethink some of those systems in ways we're not quite there yet, right? And it's something we're beginning to see. When you start fusing layers of information together, powerful effects happen. That's a good thing, but it's also a security concern.
That's like the most sort of upfront description I've had from someone to describe like how classification works right now and how it could work better. There was a guy, just sidebar before we finish, there was a guy in England in 2015 and he came up with a formula that would tell you based on what you were trying to keep secret, how many people knew that secret and how long they had to perpetuate that secret. He could tell you the longevity of any piece of secret information. So you could, in theory, apply it to any classified piece of information to determine when you should unclassify it. And if you work in classification, I encourage you to do that as quickly as possible. And my number is available here at the, in the back. So with that, I want to thank all of you for sticking around. I want to thank Ben. Do we have like closing remarks or? Yes, and we have some closing remarks. But first, please help me thank Terry for sitting and taking all these questions today.
And I'll keep it brief. Thank y'all all for coming out to our Cocktails and Conversation. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Again, thank you, Esri, for being our underwriter this evening. We have a lot of food and some alcohol left, so grab that, and we'll be sharing the recording later this week. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.